Good morning. My name is Matt, and I am one of the pastors here, and it is great to be able to be with you this morning. Excited about a week from now when we get to do the dual people here and folks at home. So we're going to take one step at a time. Excited to get to do that. But let's go ahead and jump in following Sarah's reading. Let me ask you the question: Where does murder come from? Where does genocide originate? Where does racism? We're talking about a ton in the media, right? Where does racism come from? What about anger and envy and malice and conceit and disdain? And where does it come from? What are its roots? Well, the Bible would say that the root of all of these things is one thing, and that is pride. Pride is the center of all of these sins. As a matter of fact, it's from the beginning, right? Lucifer becomes the devil through pride. Theologians from Aristotle on have basically been making the declaration that pride is not equal to all other sins. Instead, actually, all other sins seem to get their roots, seem to come from pride. Pride. Pride, according to the scriptures, is a hyper-concentration on the self. It's an absorption with the self. C.S. Lewis, who's written a ton on pride and on humility, maybe more than anybody else, says this. He says, pride is the ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration upon self. And one of the clearest examples of this ruthless, sleepless, smileless concentration on self is this man named Haman, that we get to see here and discover at the beginning of chapter 3, where he, as the villain, is introduced into the plot of the book of Esther. He's the villain, but he's the villain because through him, as we saw just a minute ago, he's plotting the destruction of the people of God. This people of God, this covenant people of God who've been brought into exile, as Steve talked about last week, because of their disobedience, God in judgment brought them into exile. And from exile, Haman is seeking to have them all destroyed across the Persian kingdom. So, this morning, we're going to look at this case study in pride. And Haman is maybe one of the best in all of Scripture as to a case study of pride. So we're going to look at it in two ways. We're going to look first at the composition of a prideful heart. And second, we're going to look at how we're rescued from a prideful heart. The composition of a prideful heart, then how in the world are we rescued from a prideful heart? All right, well, first, the composition of a prideful heart. A prideful heart, first, is a heart that has to boast. Like, think about it. Like, what was Haman like? What was his declaration? He has everything, right? He has money, popularity, he has family, prestige, he's got power, he's got everything. As a matter of fact, he's so full of himself, if you will, that he pulls his wife and his friends together, and in verse 11, he kind of goes on this diatribe of all that's awesome about being Haman. He says, "And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his son, his progeny, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king." Verse 12, "Then Haman said, 'Even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king.'" Like, the most common and obvious manifestation of pride, for sure, is superiority pride. Right? We're most familiar with it because we probably see it the most likely in other people. It's also the thing that we recognize in others because it's the manifestation of us declaring our superiority of pride by constantly doing the math ourselves, or watching other people do this, of course, constantly doing the math and going like, yeah, I measure up. Actually, I succeed beyond that. You see, pride of superiority says, how am I doing? Constantly self-obsessed. How am I doing? How am I doing? And answers it, I'm doing pretty well. How am I coming off? I'm coming off pretty well. That's what the pride of superiority says. That's how it relates. I'm doing pretty well. We're doing the math and we're coming out ahead. That's one of the form of pride. And as I said, it's probably the most obvious to us. It's what we're most familiar in seeing in other people. But candidly, it's one of the ones that is most difficult in its form to see in ourselves or in the mirror. So there's this pride of boasting. But then what's fascinating about pride is that a prideful heart is also remarkably fragile. Like remarkably fragile. At the same time as it's boastful, it's remarkably fragile. Think about this. Look at Haman. He has all of these things, and yet it takes so little to take him from the highest high to the lowest low. We see in verse 9, Haman comes out, right? So he's just had like the day of days. He got invited to a special feast with Esther and the king alone. Like he already knew he's the vizier, right? So he's the number 2 in the land anyway, but now he really knows he's on top of the world. And he comes out of that feast super excited. And verse 9 it says, and Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. Can't you just see him like, absolutely, I've got this. The next word, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. And so he goes home, as we said, he gathers his wife and his friends, and he tells them of all his grandeur, which we just talked about. But he gets to verse 13 at the end of declaring all these things, and listen to what he says. Verse 13, he says, I'm amazing in all these ways, yet all this is worth nothing to me, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. It's worth nothing to me. Pride turns everything into a means to an end. See, it's not the thing itself that we're concerned about. It's how it can get us what we have to have. Getting the respect we must have, the approval we have to get. That's the reason why Haman has zero satisfaction in all that he's achieved, in all that he possesses, in all that he's attained. He has no satisfaction in it. He doesn't even care about it, it seemed, as long as one person doesn't seem to honor him as he seems to believe he should be. He has to have all honor him. Which is why C.S. Lewis famously said about pride, he said, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. So pride gets no pleasure out of having the thing. So all the possessions he's accumulated, all the success he's had, all the power he's received, all the sons, the 10 sons of Haman, they mean nothing to him because they were a means to an end. And suddenly what we realize is what's true of all of us, right? That we may think that we have pride in our success or in our looks and how funny we are or how smart we are. But reality is that shifts immediately when we find ourselves around people who are smarter, right? They have more smarts, or they have more success, or they're just better with a punchline than we are, or they are just more beautiful. And suddenly, all the things that we took joy in, we find no joy in them at all. You see, they weren't the thing, they were the means to a thing, and suddenly it is no longer there. This is why boasting, being the superiority form of pride, points to the reality of a second form of pride, and that is the pride of inferiority. Where we believe, as we come to realize by looking at other people that we're constantly comparing to, that in fact, maybe I don't measure up, or I'm not doing this as well as I thought I could. I'm not as successful as I want to be, and maybe I'm nothing. Maybe I'm a failure. But do you see how that's not humility? That's still self-obsession. That's still a hyper-concentration on what isn't. It's still born out of a comparison that says, I don't have, which implies if I did have it, if I was superior, then I would be able to boast. But it's still self-concentration, self-absorption, and the Bible calls that pride, which is why the definition of humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's not beating yourself up and pulling yourself down. It's thinking about yourself less. If you spend time with someone who's really humble, you don't come away thinking about how humble they are. You actually don't come away thinking about them at all. You come away realizing how cared for, seen, known, and heard you were by them. It's because they're not about themselves. They were about you. They were not self-focused. They were thinking about the other. That's the manifestation of what humility looks like. The prideful heart is remarkably fragile. It boasts and it is fragile, and oftentimes it will swing from boasting to fragility, as we see right here with Haman. But thirdly, a prideful heart turns individual offenses into general disdains for groups of people. A prideful heart turns individual offenses into general disdains for groups of people. This is nuance. Listen to this, what happens here with Haman in verse 5 and 6 of chapter 3. Haman was filled with fury. Mordecai will not bow to him, and he's filled with fury. And it says in verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Another way of saying that, the NIV says he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai, or he decided it was not enough to just lay hands on Mordecai. And so it goes on to say, so as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, the Jews, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai. You see, by the time you get to verse 13 of chapter 5, he's no longer just Mordecai, he's Mordecai the Jew. It wasn't enough for Mordecai to have offended him. Haman had caricatured the people of Mordecai according to the offense of Mordecai. In Haman's mind, it wasn't just Mordecai who would not honor him as he thought fit for his position. It was all the people of Mordecai would never honor him in the way that was fit for his position. And so he sought to destroy all of the people. And that's common to us. Now, obviously, this is extreme, right? We look at Haman and we're like, yeah, who goes around and destroys entire groups of people? Well, I think we have history of genocide and that points to that reality. But even in our own hearts, like, this is how pride works. One person's offense or a few people's actions turn into a conclusion, a declaration, a judgment about them, whoever them might be. And of course, depending on where you stand or which side you're looking at, them may be one or another. It could be, anyone who's going to wear a MAGA hat and is going to vote for Donald Trump is an idiot. Or it may be, listen, anyone who's really going to, like Black Lives Matter protest is really just trying to find a way in which they can riot so that they can steal a bunch of stuff that doesn't belong to them. You see how we decided to make something about everyone. We've taken something specific and made it about a whole set of people. Or maybe it's about, hey, listen, people who wear masks because are just fearful people who don't realize that actually is not going to help them anyway, and they're just actually trying to push their fear onto other people, or the other way around, people coming and saying, listen, if you've been paying attention to any social media context, it's like people saying, listen, if you're not going to continue social distancing, you don't love people. I've seen some stuff that says, listen, you're not a Christian if you're not going to continue social distancing the way I think social distancing should work. You see what's happening? Polarization, right? It's what pride does. It says, what you are, what this person is or declaring is true of all of you. So how has a particular offense by a family member, by a particular person from your work, or by someone that's been close and is no longer close, how has the offense of that individual framed your view or understanding of an entire group of people? This is how racism is born, right? This is how genocide is birthed. This is how hatred emerges in culture and community. One of the areas of pride that God's kind of put his finger on for me this week is in the area of nuance. I'm going to have to explain. But one of the things that I feel comes relatively natural to me has been growing over the last several years, that I actually really enjoy trying to get a sense of understanding both sides of two particular elements, right? The merits of two distinct and different positions. And the fact that everything, the right, the left, they all have elements that are actually good and true, and they're actually more alike than they're different sometimes. And I've found that to be one of the things that maybe bothers me, or that I struggle with, or that offends me, is that I think we've lost the art of nuance, lost the art of being able to look at something wholeheartedly and be able to pull from both directions and both sides. And what I realized is that I get really offended by polarizing people, by dogmatic people. That it's very difficult for me. And what was so ironic is that I realized that I was getting to the place where I was feeling all this pride and was becoming unnuanced about unnuanced people. Does that make sense? Like I was being prideful about people who aren't nuanced. And I was polarizing unnuanced people. I was I was dogmatic about my nuance. Do you see how insipid it is? And of course, it's those people, right? I'm nuanced. But you see it? There it is, right there. And it's in all of us. It's in each of us. Lastly, a prideful heart is deadly. Of course, you can look throughout the entire picture of Scripture, and we can look across our world and realize that pride is deadly. And as we're going to see, the attempts by Haman are to bring death about, but they're deadly for us as people. They're deadly to ourselves. And one of the reasons they're deadly is because they make us fools. We see this with Haman. He's unable to do or look at anything other than his own perception, to hear anything other than his own opinion. Look at verse 10 and following of chapter 5. It says, "Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh." And he says, "And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches." He brings them to him. He tells them how it is. And then he only allows that which is the feedback of what he wants to hear. And of course, he's trained them to do just that. And they give him exactly what he wants to hear. Pride makes us deaf to criticism and unable to grow from our own mistakes. And imagine, this is an exercise I always try to think about when I think of a villain, because it's very easy to take Haman and just put him in the villain category. But to think about, was there another way? Like, imagine what it would have looked like if one of his friends had said, "Listen, Haman, you just recounted all your blessings. It seems like disproportionate reaction in light of all you just enumerated, that this one guy not bowing down to you, something's going on. What's going on underneath you? I think there's more freedom for you to have." I don't know if that happens in the Persian kingdom, but imagine that. Imagine if Zeresh, his wife, had said, "Listen, Haman, what if there's something going on in Mordecai that you don't understand? Maybe there's a good reason why he doesn't bow down to you that you and I wouldn't know. What would it cost you to go and find out, to ask him, to get a sense, to move towards him?" Imagine that. See, he chose death, but there was a road to life. There was an opportunity for him to be challenged, to hear a different narrative, to ask questions, and to allow his pride to dissipate. But pride leads to death. Actual death, or just death to our own souls and to the people and the relationships around us. Bottom line is this. There's a Haman in all of us, right? There's a Haman in every single one of us. And if you don't believe me, just think about the fact that probably over the course of the last 10 minutes or so, as I've been talking about different kinds of pride, you've probably been thinking about specific people. I suspect if you're like me, and I'm saying this because even as I wrote this, I thought of specific people. So I'm just saying, if you're like me, you're thinking of someone else, which is by definition pride, superiority. It's a heart full of pride, right? That's what this manifests. And so bottom line is, we all have Haman in us. Left to ourselves, we will find ourselves going in that direction. And it's, of course, insipid. So let me ask you the question. Who is standing at the gate of your life and won't bow down to what you think is important or to what you value? Who won't agree with your version of reality? Who offends you by what they believe, by how they act? Who offends you by what aisle they sit on side of the aisle they sit on, or what theological position they're willing or seeking to hold? Who won't bow down to you?